This story is titled, My Father Picked His New Wife's Children Over Me. I finally stood up, packed my bags, and never returned. Hey Reddit, I've been hesitating about posting this for a long time. There's a lot to unpack, but I need to get it off my chest. Growing up, my dad Henry and I were inseparable, like two peas in a pod. He was my absolute hero, and that's not an exaggeration. We had this incredible bond that I thought nothing could ever break. My parents divorced when I was 8. Thankfully, it wasn't one of those ugly divorces you hear about. They both made it work for my sake, putting aside their differences to co-parent effectively. I stayed with my mom during the week, but weekends were all about dad. Those weekends were what I lived for. He'd pick me up after school on Friday, and I'd basically launch myself into the car, already excited about whatever plans he had made for us. Dad wasn't one of those hands-off fathers who just let you watch TV while they did their own thing. He made every weekend feel special and meaningful. We'd go hiking in the mountains, where he'd teach me about different plants and animals. He'd show me how to fix things around the house, instilling a sense of independence and capability that I still carry with me. Sometimes we'd just chill watching documentaries because he knew I loved learning random trivia. He was always telling me how proud he was of me. Like seriously, always. If I aced a test or won a spelling bee, he'd look me in the eye and say, "You're my smart, strong girl." Those words meant everything to me. They were my foundation, my security. For a long time, I genuinely thought nothing could ever come between us. But when I turned 13, everything changed. That's when Dad met Nicole. At first, I didn't mind her. She was bubbly and friendly, always asking about school or my favorite books. She seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. Nicole had 2 kids from her previous marriage. Ethan was 12 and Lisa was 10. They seemed nice enough, and for a while, I thought it might be cool to have siblings. I was even looking forward to building relationships with them. Then they moved in together, and that's when everything started to shift. Nicole quit her job not long after, saying she wanted to focus on family life. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it meant Dad had to take on extra hours at the hospital. He's a pediatric surgeon, so his work was already demanding, but now he started coming home later and later. When he was home, all his attention went to Nicole and her kids. I tried to adjust, telling myself it was just a new family dynamic and things would settle down eventually. But the more time passed, the more I realized that settling down just meant I was slowly becoming invisible in my own family. Dinners became all about Ethan's baseball games or Lisa's ballet recitals. I'd mentioned something I was excited about, like the science fair project I'd worked my butt off on, and I'd get a polite, "That's great, sweetie," before the conversation shifted back to them. It wasn't just the small stuff, though. Nicole's kids always seemed to come first, no matter what. I remember one summer I really wanted to visit my grandparents, Dad's parents. It was something we did every year and I looked forward to it. But Nicole suggested we go to a theme park instead because Lisa had never been to one. Guess whose plans got scrapped? Yep, mine. But things started to get really bad during my junior year of high school. That's when my mom sat me down with a serious expression and said, "There's something you need to know about your college fund." She told me that Dad had used it. All of it. I was in total shock. Like, what do you mean he used it? Apparently, Dad had drained the fund to pay for Ethan's private school tuition. Nicole had convinced him that Ethan was struggling at public school and needed a better environment. So Dad took the money he'd been saving for my future and used it on her son. Mom only found out because she'd asked Dad about the fund while they were sorting through some old paperwork. She thought I had a right to know, and she was right. I didn't even wait to process what my mom had told me. I called my dad that night and asked if it was true. At first, he tried to act like it wasn't a big deal. Ethan really needed the support, he said, as though that justified everything. "We'll figure something out for your college." I remember sitting there on the phone completely floored by his casual attitude. "Figure something out?" I asked, my voice shaking. "That was my college fund, Dad. How could you just spend it without even talking to me?" His response cut deep. "You're smart. You'll be fine. Your mom can help, and I'll pitch in where I can when the time comes." Like it was no big deal that my future had just been tossed aside. I hung up on him and cried for hours. Over the next few days, I tried to wrap my head around it. This was the same man who'd always said I was his #1 girl. The same man who promised he'd always have my back. And yet when it came down to it, he chose Nicole's son over me. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that he didn't even consider how this would affect me. When I finally talked to him again, he doubled down. He said Ethan was struggling and needed a better school, that I'd understand someday. But I didn't understand. Not then, and not even now. All I could think about was how unfair it was. He'd promised that money was for my education, and now it was gone. A few months later, as if draining my college fund wasn't bad enough, I found out Dad had bought Ethan a brand new SUV for his 18th birthday. My stomach dropped when I heard. I doubted if he was the same person who told me he couldn't afford to help with my tuition, yet somehow he had the money to splurge on a luxury car for Nicole's son. I could clearly see how much Ethan was struggling after that. Our relationship shifted permanently. I didn't see him the same way anymore. Every time I went to his house, I felt like I didn't belong there. Nicole would make little comments about how I didn't visit often, but when I did, it was the same story. Dinner conversations revolved around Ethan and Lisa. Any attempt I made to talk about my own life was brushed aside. It wasn't just the college fund. It was a pattern. Dad missing my school events because Lisa had a recital. Family vacations being planned around their schedules. Every decision he made seemed to prioritize them over me. By the time senior year rolled around, I'd stopped expecting much from him. I still saw him occasionally, but it felt more like an obligation than something I wanted to do. The man who used to make me feel like the most important person in the world had made it clear where I stood in his new family dynamic, and it wasn't at the center. So my relationship with Dad felt more like a chore than anything else. Every visit, every conversation, it all felt forced, like we were just going through the motions. I'd stopped expecting much from him after the whole college fund thing. But the way things played out over that year showed me just how far down the totem pole I'd fallen in his life. I didn't cut him off completely, though. I kept visiting on weekends once in a while, mostly because Mom encouraged me. "He's still your father," she'd say, like that made everything okay. But every time I stepped into that house, it felt like I was a guest in someone else's home. Nicole and her kids had completely taken over. One weekend, I showed up and immediately regretted it. The second I walked through the door, Nicole started in with, "Oh, look who finally decided to grace us with her presence." She said it with this fake smile, but her tone was anything but playful. I just laughed it off, but inside I was fuming. I mean, really? I'm the one making an effort to visit, and that's what I get? Dinner that night was exactly what I expected. Nicole spent half the meal talking about how Lisa's dance recital was coming up and how stressful it was for her to juggle everything. Ethan chimed in about his baseball tryouts, and of course Dad was completely engaged, nodding along and asking questions. I sat there, trying to find a moment to jump in and share something about my own life. When I finally mentioned that I'd been accepted to a few colleges, Nicole barely let me finish before turning the conversation back to Lisa's rehearsal schedule. Dad didn't even notice, or if he did, he didn't care. I sat there staring at my plate, wondering why I even bothered. It wasn't just the family dinners, though. It was everything. Nicole had this way of making me feel like an outsider without ever being outright rude. Like when she'd planned family outings without even asking if I wanted to join. I'd hear about it after the fact, when Lisa or Ethan would casually mention how much fun they had at the zoo or the movies or wherever. One time, I overheard them talking about a camping trip they were planning for the weekend. When I asked Dad about it, he just shrugged and said, "Oh, I didn't think you'd be interested." Like, really? We used to go camping all the time. It was our thing. But now it was like I didn't even exist in his mind when making plans. The worst part was how normal it all seemed to them. Nicole acted like I was some distant relative popping in for an occasional visit, not Dad's actual daughter. And Dad just went along with it, like this was the way things were supposed to be. I tried talking to him about it once, but he brushed me off. "You're overthinking it," he said. "You've got your own life now. You don't need to be here all the time." Maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't need to be there. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt to be so casually dismissed from his life. By the time spring rolled around, I'd started to check out emotionally. I still visited occasionally, but I kept my walls up. I'd sit through dinner nodding and smiling at the right moments, but I wasn't really there. It was like I'd become a spectator in my own family, watching from the sidelines while they went on with their lives. One weekend, I decided to test the waters and see if Dad even noticed how disconnected I was. I barely said a word during dinner, just nodded along while they talked about Lisa's upcoming recital and Ethan's baseball games. Dad didn't say anything to me the entire meal. Not one question about school, my college plans, or anything else going on in my life. Nicole, of course, filled the silence with her usual chatter about how hard it was to juggle everything with two kids, as if I wasn't sitting right there, also his kid. After dinner, I tried to have a one-on-one conversation with Dad. I asked if we could go for a walk like we used to, just the two of us. He agreed, and I thought maybe this was my chance to really talk to him about how I felt. But halfway through the walk, while I was about to tell him how left out I felt and how much he'd changed, Nicole called his phone. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but whatever it was urgent enough for him to cut our time short. "Sorry, sweetie," he said, patting me on the shoulder like I was a child. "Nicole needs me to help with something at home." And that was that. Our conversation was over before it even began. I rarely visited after that. At first, I felt guilty about it, like I was abandoning Dad. But the truth was, it hurt less to stay away. I focused on school and my own plans instead. I got a part-time job to start saving for college, since Dad's promise of figuring something out was obviously just empty words. Mom tried to help as much as she could, but money was tight. Honestly, Mom was my biggest cheerleader during this time. She wasn't just supportive, she was my rock. Every time I came home feeling invisible or frustrated after a weekend at Dad's, she was there waiting with a listening ear and my favorite cup of tea. She never badmouthed Dad, but she validated my feelings and encouraged me to focus on building my own future. I didn't bring anything happening in my life up to Dad anymore. What was the point? He was too busy playing super dad to Nicole's kids to notice anything I was going through. The final straw came a few weeks before my high school graduation. I'd been hoping, praying, that Dad would actually show up for this one. It wasn't like I'd asked him for much over the past year. All I wanted was for him to be there to see me walk across that stage and hear my name called. But a week before the ceremony, Nicole called me. Mind you, not Dad. Nicole. She said, "Hey, just wanted to let you know that your dad won't be able to make it to your graduation. Lisa's dance competition is that same day, and you know how important that is to her." I didn't even know what to say. I just sat there holding the phone, feeling this mix of anger and disbelief. She didn't apologize. She didn't even pretend to care about how I felt. It was just, Lisa's thing is more important. Period. I didn't bother calling Dad to argue. What was the point? He'd made his choice just like he always did. I wasn't expecting much from Dad anymore. After everything, missing my graduation, draining my college fund, and constantly prioritizing Nicole's kids, I had lowered my expectations to basically nothing. But even so, around that time his 50th birthday approached, and I still wanted to acknowledge it. It felt like one of those things you just had to do, you know? No matter how distant we'd become, he was still my dad. A week before his birthday, I picked out a gift for him. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a book about World War II history. I knew he'd love it. He was always a history buff, and we used to talk about that stuff all the time when I was younger. It felt like a safe, thoughtful choice, something that might remind him of the bond we used to have. On the day of his birthday, I decided to swing by his house after work to drop it off. I didn't text or call ahead because in my mind, this was just a casual visit. I figured we'd chat for a bit, I'd give him the gift, and that would be it. But when I pulled into the driveway, I realized something was off. The house was lit up like a Christmas tree, with cars parked all along the street. I could hear music and laughter coming from the backyard. For a second, I thought maybe I'd gotten the date wrong. But no, it was definitely his birthday. I sat in my car trying to process what I was seeing. I wasn't invited. That realization hit me like a brick. This wasn't just a small family gathering. It was a full-blown party, a party for his 50th birthday. And I wasn't even told about it. Part of me wanted to turn around and drive away, just leave the gift on the porch and pretend I never came. But another part of me, maybe the part that still believed there was a chance to fix things, decided to go in anyway. I knocked on the door, and Nicole answered. Her smile froze when she saw me, like she was trying to figure out what I was doing there. "Oh," she said after a beat. "We didn't know you were coming." I forced a smile and held up the gift. "I just wanted to drop this off for Dad. Is he around?" She hesitated for a second, then stepped aside to let me in. "He's in the backyard," she said, gesturing toward the noise. I could feel her eyes on me as I walked through the house, and it took everything in me not to turn around and ask why I wasn't invited. The backyard was packed. There were string lights everywhere, a catered buffet set up along one side, and even a DJ in the corner. It looked like something out of a Pinterest board. Dad was near the grill, laughing with a group of relatives I hadn't seen in years. He looked up when he saw me and waved me over. "Lily, hey," he said, pulling me into a quick hug. "I wasn't expecting you." I handed him the gift. "Happy birthday," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He opened it right there and smiled when he saw the book. "Wow, this is great. Thanks, kiddo." For a moment, I almost forgot why I was upset. He seemed genuinely happy to see me, and it reminded me of the dad I used to know. But then the moment passed, and I was standing there surrounded by people who all knew about this party, people who had been invited while I was clearly an afterthought. "Did Nicole not tell you about the party?" Dad asked casually, as if this was a minor oversight. "No," I said, trying not to sound as hurt as I felt. "I just came by to drop off your gift. I didn't know there was a party." His face fell for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "Well, I'm glad you're here now. Grab a plate and stick around." But the way he said it didn't feel welcoming. It felt obligatory, like he was trying to smooth things over without actually addressing the problem. I stayed for about 20 minutes, just long enough to make polite small talk with a few relatives and force down a plate of food. Nicole kept hovering nearby, watching me like she was afraid I'd cause a scene. I thought about confronting Dad right then and there, asking him why I wasn't invited. But I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of everyone. When I left, I kept replaying the whole thing in my head, wondering if I'd done something to deserve being left out. Was it because I didn't visit often enough? Because I didn't fit into their perfect little family dynamic? Was Nicole the problem? But no matter what the reason was, the message was clear. I was already an outsider in my own father's life. For days afterward, I felt this heavy weight in my chest. I couldn't focus on school, couldn't concentrate at work. Every time I thought about the party, I felt this mix of anger and sadness that I couldn't put into words. It wasn't just about the party. It was about everything: the college fund, the missed graduation, the constant favoritism. This party was just another reminder that I wasn't a priority in his life. I tried to push it aside, to tell myself it didn't matter. But it did. It mattered a lot. I didn't call Dad after that, and he didn't call me either. Weeks went by, and the silence between us grew louder and louder. I thought maybe he'd reach out to apologize, to explain why I wasn't invited. But he never did. It was like the whole thing never happened. At some point, I realized I was holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. The dad I grew up idolizing, the one who used to make me feel like I was his whole world, was gone. Or maybe he was never really there in the first place, and I was just too young to see it. Either way, it broke something in me, and no matter how much I wanted to fix it, I couldn't do it alone. Then came Lisa's engagement. I found out about it the same way I found out about most things with Dad's new family, through social media. There it was on my feed, a picture of Lisa grinning with an oversized diamond ring on her finger, surrounded by a bunch of people I didn't even recognize. Dad and Nicole were front and center, of course, looking like proud parents. The caption read, "Can't wait to marry the love of my life! Thanks to my amazing family for making this day so special." At first, I thought maybe the engagement party was something small, thrown together last minute. I tried not to jump to conclusions, but as more pictures started popping up, it became clear that this wasn't some casual gathering. It was a full-blown event. Decorations, catered food, even a freaking photo booth. And guess who wasn't invited? Again, I didn't call Dad to ask why. What was the point? He'd either blame Nicole like he always did, or act like it wasn't a big deal. So I stayed quiet and told myself I didn't care. But it was hard not to care when every other day someone new was posting pictures of the party. Aunts, uncles, cousins, they were all there, smiling and laughing, like this was the happiest moment in the world. I thought maybe Lisa's wedding itself would be different. Surely I'd get an invitation to that, right? After all, a wedding is a big deal. Even if I wasn't close to Lisa, I was still family. Or at least I was supposed to be. Weeks passed and I didn't hear anything. No phone calls, no texts, no invitations in the mail. I tried to convince myself that maybe they hadn't sent them out yet. But when I asked a cousin about it, she let it slip that the invites had already gone out weeks ago. "I'm sure yours is on the way," she said, giving me a look like she knew that wasn't true. A few days later, I got a text from one of my cousins. It read, "Hey Lily, Lisa wanted me to let you know the wedding is on June 15th at Riverfront Gardens. Hope you can make it." That was it. No explanation for why I wasn't told sooner. No acknowledgement that I was family. Not even a direct invite from Lisa or Dad. Just a lazy secondhand message passed along, like I was their neighbor. It didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like a formality they couldn't bother to handle properly. I stared at the text for a long time, trying to figure out how I felt about it. Hurt, sure. Angry, definitely. But more than anything, I just felt tired. Tired of always being the afterthought. Tired of trying to force myself into a family that didn't seem to care if I was part of it. For a brief moment, I considered going. Maybe it would keep the peace. Maybe showing up would prove I was the bigger person. But then I thought about what it would really be like. Sitting in the back row, watching Lisa beam while Dad gave his toast, probably calling her the daughter he was so proud of, while I sat there wondering why he couldn't ever say those words about me anymore. I realized I couldn't do it. Not because I wanted to make a point, but because I needed to protect myself. Going to that wedding wasn't going to fix anything. It wasn't going to magically make me part of their family. If anything, it would just be another reminder that I was on the outside looking in. I decided not to go. I didn't announce it to anyone or make a big deal about it. I just quietly made the choice and stuck to it. Of course, Dad wasn't going to let it slide. A couple of days later, he called me. As soon as I saw his name on the screen, I knew what the conversation was going to be about. "Lily," he started, and I could already hear the irritation in his voice. "I just heard from Nicole that you're not planning to come to Lisa's wedding. Is that true?" "Yeah," I said, keeping my tone calm. "I decided it's better if I don't." "Better?" he repeated, like the word didn't make sense. "How is that better? She's your stepsister. This is one of the biggest days of her life, and you're just not coming?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Dad, I don't feel like I'm really wanted there," I said. "It's obvious this invitation was sent out of obligation, not because anyone actually cares if I come. I think it's better for everyone if I stay home." He scoffed, and I could picture him shaking his head on the other end of the line. "Not everything has to be about you, Lily," he said. "This isn't about whether you feel wanted or not. It's about Lisa. This is her big day, and you're making it about your feelings. Can't you put those aside for once?" I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "Dad, this isn't just about the wedding," I said. "It's about everything. The college fund, my graduation, your birthday party, the engagement party. Do you not see how many times I've been excluded? How many times I've been made to feel like I don't matter?" "Jesus, Lily," he snapped. "You're always so dramatic. Nicole has worked so hard to keep this family together, and all you ever do is complain. Maybe if you tried being more supportive, things wouldn't feel so tense." "Supportive?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You're telling me to be supportive when I've been left out over and over again? You spent my college fund on Ethan. You missed my graduation for Lisa's recital. You didn't even invite me to your birthday party. And now you're telling me I'm the one who isn't supportive? That's not fair," he said quickly, but I could hear the guilt creeping into his voice. "You know it's not like that." "Really?" "Because it feels exactly like that," I said. "It feels like you've chosen Nicole and her kids over me every single time. And the worst part is, you don't even care how much it's hurt me." There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought he might actually apologize. But instead, he sighed and said, "Look, I don't have time for this. You're either coming to the wedding or you're not. Just know that if you don't, it's going to cause problems. Lisa will be upset, Nicole will be upset, and I really don't want to deal with that." "Then don't," I said, my voice sharp. "Deal with your perfect little family and leave me out of it." I hung up before he could respond. The days leading up to the wedding were harder than I expected. I tried to focus on school and work, but my mind kept drifting back to that conversation. I replayed his words over and over, trying to figure out where I went wrong. Was I really being selfish? Dramatic? Was it too much to want to feel like I mattered? On the day of the wedding, I stayed home. I turned off my phone and tried to distract myself with a book, but I couldn't focus. I kept picturing Dad standing up to give a speech, talking about how proud he was of Lisa, and the thought made my stomach twist. A few days later, I found out through a cousin that Nicole had been bad-mouthing me at the reception. She told anyone who would listen that I was jealous of Lisa and didn't care about family. It hurt, but honestly, it wasn't surprising. Nicole had been painting me as the villain for years. What did surprise me was that some people believed her. I got a couple of texts from extended family members saying they were disappointed in me for missing the wedding, like I'd committed some unforgivable sin. I didn't bother replying. I knew there was no point trying to explain myself to people who had already made up their minds. At that point, I realized I couldn't win. No matter what I did, I'd always be the bad guy in their eyes. If I stood up for myself, I was dramatic. If I stayed quiet, I was unsupportive. And if I walked away, I was selfish. Something had to change. I couldn't keep bending over backward for people who didn't even want me around. I tried to move on after Lisa's wedding. I stopped waiting for calls or texts from Dad and started focusing on my own life instead. But then, a few months later, I found out through a cousin about another family event. This time it was a backyard barbecue at Dad and Nicole's house. a big one with extended family invited. Apparently, it was meant to be a celebration for Ethan graduating from college. And, as always, I wasn't invited. I'd love to say I was surprised, but at this point, it was just par for the course. Still, hearing about it secondhand stung, especially since Ethan's graduation was apparently such a big deal that they were throwing a full-blown party, while my own graduation barely warranted a passing mention. I tried to let it go. What was the point of dwelling on it? But as the days went by, the anger started bubbling up. Why did they get to keep pretending like I didn't exist? Why did Dad get to play the role of a proud, devoted parent while completely ignoring the damage he'd done to our relationship? It's not like I did something to them that makes them always leave me out. I wasn't going to let them get away with it this time. I had enough of being pushed to the side, and I wanted to throw everything in their faces. The day of the barbecue, I got in my car, drove to their house, and walked straight up to the front door. I didn't knock. I didn't hesitate. I just opened the door and stepped inside. The sound of laughter and music spilled out from the backyard, and for a moment I stood there taking it all in. The house was packed. It seemed like most of the family was there. Relatives I hadn't seen in years, people who hadn't so much as texted me, but somehow showed up for this celebration. I could hear voices calling out congratulations, laughter echoing through the walls, and the faint clink of glasses. Nicole was the first to notice me. She was walking through the living room with a tray of drinks when she spotted me by the door. Her face froze in surprise before twisting into that fake sugary smile I knew all too well. "Well, look who decided to show up," she said, setting the tray down on the table. "Did you finally remember where your father lives? Or did your mother teach you another trick to get attention?" That hit me like a slap. She had always been passive-aggressive, but this was different. She wasn't even trying to hide her disdain anymore. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking. "Oh, don't play innocent," she snapped, her smile disappearing. "You've always been like this. Selfish, dramatic, just like your mother. She's the one who taught you how to act like the world revolves around you." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, Dad walked in from the backyard. His eyes widened when he saw me standing there. "Lily, what are you doing here?" "I came to see my family," I said, putting as much emphasis on the word as I could. Nicole let out a short, bitter laugh. "Family? That's rich coming from someone who skips her stepsister's wedding and can't be bothered to pick up the phone. Are you serious right now?" I shot back. "You didn't even invite me to this party. I found out from a cousin. How many more times are you going to exclude me before you admit that you just don't want me around?" The room went quiet. For a second, I thought Dad might finally stand up for me, but instead he turned to Nicole. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone sharp. "What's going on is that your daughter decided to barge in and make a scene," Nicole said, crossing her arms. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Make a scene?" I repeated. "I wouldn't have to make a scene if you treated me like I mattered instead of constantly putting Ethan and Lisa first." Dad turned to me then, his face hard. "That's enough, Lily. You don't get to come into my house and disrespect my wife like this." "Your wife?" I snapped, the anger boiling over. "She's the one disrespecting me. She's been doing it for years, and you just stand there and let her." "Don't blame me for your problems," Nicole said, her voice dripping with venom. "You've been nothing but a thorn in this family's side. You're bitter because you can't stand that my kids are more successful than you." That did it. I wasn't going to let her rewrite the narrative. I laughed bitterly. "You mean Ethan, who had my college fund handed to him on a silver platter? Or Lisa, who's had everything handed to her while I've been busting my ass to get through school? Let's not pretend this is about success. This is about you trying to erase me from my own family." Dad stepped in then, raising his voice. "Lily, stop! You're embarrassing yourself." "No, Dad," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm embarrassing you. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You don't like it when I point out the truth. You don't like being reminded of how much you've let me down." His face darkened, and for the first time I saw just how deep his loyalty to Nicole ran. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said coldly. "Nicole has done more for this family than you ever have. If you can't accept that, then maybe you should get out of here." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. A few family members glanced at each other awkwardly, shifting in their seats. My Aunt Denise, one of the few relatives who had always been kind to me, looked shocked, her mouth slightly open as she leaned closer to whisper something to her husband. "Henry, that's too far," another relative muttered, just loud enough for me to catch it. Meanwhile, Nicole stood behind Dad with her arms crossed, a smug smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She didn't look surprised by his words. If anything, she looked satisfied, like this was exactly the response she had been waiting for. The words hit me like a slap, but I refused to let him see how much they hurt. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out the legal papers I'd been holding onto for months. "Fine," I said, my hand shaking as I shoved the papers into his chest. "If I don't belong here, then you can deal with this. It's a formal claim for the college fund you stole from me. Maybe Ethan's private school and his shiny new SUV were worth it, but I'm not letting you get away with it anymore." The room went silent. Nicole's mouth opened and closed like a fish, and Dad just stared at the papers, his face pale. "You want to talk about family?" I said, my voice rising. "Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't treat their own like strangers. You've been nothing but a puppet for Nicole, and I'm done pretending otherwise." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out the door. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of voices rising as the chaos I'd caused sank in. For the first time in years, I felt like I'd taken control of the situation instead of letting it control me. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the heaviness in my chest. I had said my piece, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of something I'd been holding onto for far too long. 2 weeks after the barbecue, Dad finally reached out. I let the call go to voicemail, but his message was exactly what I expected, full of anger and blame. "Lily, I can't believe you're doing this," he said, his voice dripping with frustration. "You're really going to drag this family into legal drama over some money? Ethan needed that school, and you've had plenty of opportunities to figure out your own way. I can't believe you'd stoop this low." I deleted the voicemail without replying. What was there to say? He didn't even try to understand my perspective or take responsibility for his actions. In his eyes, I was the villain, and Nicole was probably fanning the flames as usual. A week later, I received a letter from Dad's lawyer. He was contesting my claim, arguing that the college fund had always been family money, and that he had the right to use it as he saw fit. It felt horrible, but I wasn't surprised. If there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that Dad would do anything to avoid admitting he was wrong. My lawyer, thankfully, was prepared. We had documentation proving the fund was specifically set up for my education, including old statements with my name listed as the beneficiary. It wasn't just about the money. It was about holding him accountable for years of broken promises. The legal process dragged on for months. During that time, Dad's calls became less frequent, and when he did reach out, it was never to apologize. Instead, he accused me of tearing the family apart and putting everyone in an uncomfortable position. Nicole, of course, wasn't subtle about her disdain. She took to social media, posting vague but clearly targeted comments about ungrateful people who think they're entitled to everything. Meanwhile, extended family members started taking sides. Some reached out to show their support, telling me they'd seen how unfairly I'd been treated for years. Others sided with Dad, claiming I was being unreasonable and should just let it go. One aunt even called me to say, "It's just money, Lily. Is it really worth ruining your relationship with your father?" But it wasn't just money. It was my future, my trust, and my dignity. All things Dad had trampled on without a second thought. I was done pretending that wasn't the case. When the case finally went to mediation, the documentation was airtight, and every excuse he tried to offer was met with hard evidence to the contrary. At one point, he actually had the nerve to say, "I thought Lily was smart enough to figure out college without the fund. She didn't need it as much as Ethan did." The mediator shut him down immediately, pointing out that the fund wasn't his to decide how to use. It was set up for me, and using it for anything else, especially without my consent, was a clear breach of trust. In the end, Dad agreed to settle. He didn't apologize or even look at me as the terms were finalized. The agreement required him to repay a significant portion of the fund over the next few years. But the money wasn't what mattered most to me. It was the fact that for once, he couldn't just sweep his actions under the rug and pretend I didn't exist. The fallout was immediate. Dad stopped calling altogether, and Nicole ramped up her social media campaign, painting me as the ungrateful daughter who had ruined the family. Extended family members whispered about the situation at gatherings I didn't attend. And the few relatives who did reach out to me seemed hesitant, like they didn't want to be caught in the middle. It was messy and exhausting, but it was also freeing in a strange way. For years, I had bent over backward to maintain a relationship with Dad, convincing myself that if I just tried harder, things would get better. But the legal battle made it clear that I wasn't the problem. He was. I'd like to say that was the end of it, but of course Nicole couldn't let it go. A few months later, she sent me a scathing email accusing me of disrespecting her family. She even had the audacity to suggest I pay back the money Dad was ordered to return, since you're the one who made a big deal about it. I didn't respond. I deleted the email and blocked her address. As for Dad, I haven't heard from him since the mediation. Part of me wonders if he'll ever try to reach out, but I'm not holding my breath. If he does, it'll probably be another attempt to shift the blame onto me or demand that I fix the relationship. But I've made peace with the fact that I don't owe him anything. Not my time, not my forgiveness, and definitely not my silence. This chapter of my life is over.